Nowhere in the pages of history can one find a greater champion of justice. Return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear.
And I'll tell you something else, too, is I cannot stand sissies.
You're going to talk about wrestling, that's redneck talk.
And guess what, fatso? I'm the world champion.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 1,000 Hours podcast from WhenItWasCool.com. This podcast can be heard at WrestlingObserver.com, Figure4Online.com, by way of my free feed at WhenItWasCool.com, and this show is produced and distributed by WhenItWasCool.com. Thank you all for joining me. So, 1,000 Hours, this is the podcast I've set aside for our discussion about the pioneer era of wrestling. And I know I feel like I've hopefully brought the two communities together a little more, those who are just fans of classic old school wrestling like we talk about on our regular show, 80s, 1980s, 90s, stuff like that. And then there are those historians who are interested in the pioneer era, and the two seem to be very different groups. And so originally thought it was a good idea to split these two shows in two. And but I think the two groups have becoming merged more into one, and I'm seeing more discussion about the pioneer era of wrestling now, more so than I've really ever seen before in Facebook groups about classic wrestling and things like that. So it does seem like hopefully my book, which is still selling rather well right now, if you don't have a copy, that's what this is all about. DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus. It's available at Amazon. If you go to WhenItWasCool.com, you'll see links there. That'll get you your best price and your best shipping and all that good stuff. So if you want to go there, just click on that at Amazon. It's about 700 pages. It's also available on Kindle, Kindle Unlimited. So if you read stuff that's electronically by Kindle, I read most of the stuff I read online nowadays, and so I hope you'll check out my book, again, DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of Wrestling. Here on this podcast, we talk all about the Pioneer Era of Wrestling, and we do this in hours. A good friend of mine, in fact, he wrote the foreword to the book, Freddie Gruber, drummer expert, no friender, and he said to me one time, I could listen to you talk about the pioneers of wrestling for 1,000 hours. And I'm like, well, that's a long time, but we'll try it. And here we are now on hour 66, and this show is sponsored. And today's sponsor is Andrew E. So thank you very much, Andrew E., for sponsoring this hour number 66. And the way this show goes and keeps going and the show ends when this is no longer viable to do, you need to sign up to become a Patreon at When It Was Cool. If you do that, we will dedicate an hour of this show to you. Or if you're already a Patreon supporter, or you just want to sponsor a episode of this show, one of the few that's about the pioneer era of wrestling, and we certainly, When It Was Cool, is doing the most research about the pioneer era of wrestling over the last few years that anybody's done. And so you can support us by PayPal or Cash App, a donation on the front page of WhenItWasCool.com. So right now we are going through the book. We're working our way through the Pioneer Omnibus book. And so as you listen to this, as we go through history here in the pages of this book, hope it will, number one, inspire you to buy the book. Again, WhenItWasCool.com. Just click on any of the links to the book there. And for another, I hope it will really spur new interest in historians looking at the pioneer era of wrestling, at new historians, new authors, new back in my day it was newsletter writers, but new podcasters, new YouTubers, whoever, and looking at this pioneer era of wrestling ever before. And I hope you use my book. My book can be a fundamental tool you can use to get dates and people and some of the major incidents in the era and build off of that. And that's certainly what I hope happens. So we're up to 1869, and we have to remember one of the most important things that happens in the history, not just of the pioneer era of wrestling, but in all of wrestling history, is the 1870 Detroit International Tournament. So we're a year before that. This Detroit tournament, I mean, it is super important, not in that it, quote, begins pro wrestling in the U.S. It certainly did not do that. We've been talking, for a while now already in the book up to this point. Lots of wrestling happened before then, but really on a national basis as far as the general populace at home. Once a week, or maybe in the cities daily, you get a newspaper and you would read about some of these wrestlers. And it would be more unified, more popular, more organized for sure after 1870. In 1870, the tournament really sets the rules of what wrestling was and what wrestling to this day was built off of. And don't forget, one of the main takeaways I want you to get, I hope you take away from this book, is that the pioneer era of wrestling was not the grandparent of mixed martial arts or UFC. And while certainly there was aspects of that there, unquestionably, and certainly there was influence there, no doubt about that, it really is the modern wrestling we see today, entertainment style pro wrestling, WWE, AEW, New Japan, Ring of Honor, TNA, NWA, all these various different groups that are around now and have been around historically. They evolved out of this era, and you will see that through the book. You will see one of the myths I really wanted to I wanted to learn more about it. Didn't want to dispel the myth. I wanted to learn if it was true or not. When I started this book, is that combat sport in America really just split into two different disciplines. It's split into entertainment style pro wrestling, and later on, because of the origins of wrestling, then MMA, UFC, whatever, split off of that, and that's really not accurate to what happened. UFC, mixed martial arts, certainly have roots in pro wrestling. They have all kinds of influences from pro wrestling, but they're not a direct descendant of pioneer era pro wrestling. So 1869 is where we're at, and February 4th, 1869, New York City, New York, Alhambra. The attendance is said to be excellent. American collar and elbow champion Homer Lane defeated young Ryan 2-0. There's also boxing matches on the show. That's a Homer Lane. We've talked quite a bit about him. We've even had individual shows looking at Homer Lane. So we all know who Homer Lane is. If not, I'll give you a point of reference. He is, as stated here, one of the early American champions in the United States throughout this series. And if you've just picked up this series, maybe you've listened to all 65 previous hours of this series, I'm not sure, but however you landed here, thank you. And to remember, when we say the American Heavyweight Championship back in the Pioneer era, we're most often talking about the American Collar and Elbow Championship, but there were others. There would later be American Greco-Roman Championship, American Mixed Styles Championship, and so on and so forth. So not always, but the most important of these was this American Collar and Elbow Championship, and Homer Lane was one of the early holders of that championship. So February 14th, 1869, Chicago, Illinois, attendance of about 1,000. Edward Cahill wrestled Pat Brennan to a draw, $500 a side, best of 3 falls. Brennan appeared to give up after his shirt was pulled up over his head, and Cahill stopped without throwing him. The referee ordered the match to continue, but neither man would, and the referee declared it a draw. And so here, this doesn't necessarily, while this on the surface sounds like a entertainment style match, it's possible this could have been legit match too. We're still in the era where you had a lot of legitimate matches also. And again, I've reiterated so much during this series over and over again just how wrestling was worked. There was working of wrestling involved all the way back to the very beginning. Now, all matches weren't worked, but there were a lot of worked matches. And but that's not to say there was never legitimate wrestling. There certainly was legitimate wrestling. And it's oftentimes hard to tell the difference just from over 100-year-old newspaper accounts. We have to do the best we can and figure it out based on the people involved, the setting, and so forth. And so this match here, February 14th, 1869, we don't really know. There's not enough information there for us to say for absolute certainty. March the 1st, 1869, the New York Daily Herald runs a new news blurb that states, quote, "Of late, wrestling matches have become very popular among the men of muscle." So wrestling is on a popularity upswing here. No question. The next year it's going to be, for the next 2 or 3 years, wrestling is going to peak, have its first real peak of popularity. Then it's going to go down a little bit and come back again. William Muldoon's going to introduce it with a kind of a spin on what had been popular, although these famous old-timers like McLaughlin and McMahon, they'll be around for a long time. And Homer Lane's one of the longest ones. He's around all the way through the rest of the 1800s, largely, even up into his 50s, Homer Lane is wrestling. March the 1st, 1869, the New York Daily Herald, that was one we just got. Let's see here. This would be March the 4th, 1869. New York City, New York, the American collar and elbow champion, Homer Lane, beats Joseph Johnson for $1,000 a side. So here's a successful title defense here by Homer Lane. March the 30th, 1869, New York City, New York, at Harry Hill's Athletic Club on Broadway. And now Harry Hill's would go through several updates in his athletic or entertainment establishment, his theater. Harry Hill's Sports, or it wasn't even always sports. Sometimes he had entertainment acts in there too. But Harry Hill's entertainment venue, would be very important in the history of professional wrestling. He's a guy you really probably, most of us never heard anything about. Harry Hill prior, unless you're just a real deep in, historian, obviously knew who Harry Hill was, but as far as just the general casual person who reads the Observer, likes the history pieces and so forth, and maybe you've even got several books on wrestling and whatever, you may even consider yourself a historian, an expert, and may have no idea who Harry Hill is. And one of the things I hope this book brings to the forefront of is just how important Harry Hill was, not just to wrestling in the pioneer era, but to wrestling in the future as well. All right, so March 30th, 1869, here at Harry Hill's, American collar and elbow champion Homer Lane wrestled Henry Grace to a draw for $1,000 a side. Grace sprained his ankle in the final fall and could not continue. The referee was Harry Hill. Now, again, I remind you, anytime Harry Hill's name's attached to any of these shows, be it at his venue, or he's the referee, or he's the manager, or he's promoting, and he'll go outside of New York some too as we go forward in history, there is a reason to attach suspicion to his name. I mean, Harry Hill was he overseen, in my opinion, a lot of working of matches. I mean, there was a lot of works happened under his name. He essentially run the first pro wrestling syndicate, the first pro wrestling trust, using Homer Lane and John McMahon, among others. So it's just anytime you see his name, perk your ears up, I guess. Pay attention. It's maybe it might be not legitimate wrestling here in the pioneer era. So April the 9th, 1869, New York City, New York, Harry Hill's Athletic Club on Broadway, American collar and elbow champion Homer Lane beat Henry Grace by forfeit when Grace this time failed to appear. It's been a little over a week since he hurt his ankle. Now upon the rematch, he just does not show up. All right, so we're going to go well over a month on down the road. They finally wrestle. This is that was from April 9th. They finally do wrestle May 31st, 1869, so over almost 2 months away. At Harry Hills, the American heavyweight champion, Homer Lane beat Harry Grace in 2 straight falls. The New York Daily Herald stated that this cleared up any question about who the champion was in the ongoing series of matches between Lane and Grace. All right. So July 20th, 1869, John Griffin is sentenced to hang in the killing of former American wrestling champion Oozle Prickett in 1868, according to the Cincinnati Enquirer newspaper. Now, if you're listening to this and you didn't listen to the last episode or the one we did earlier in the 1,000-hour series on Oozle Prickett, you should go listen to that. I'm not going to reiterate it here because we've talked about Oozle Prickett frequently over the course of 1,000 hours. He's one of the most interesting, colorful characters and champions in wrestling. And yes, the man who killed him outright, probably murdered him, shot him in the head, is about to hang for that. And we talked about that at length in the last episode. August 29th, 1869, St. Louis Globe-Democrat newspaper states, quote, Ben Hogan, the clever pugilist who trained Gallagher for his last fight with Allen, will leave today for Oneida County, New York, for the purpose of training James McLaughlin for a match with Homer Lane. The latter is the wrestling champion of America, and McLaughlin is after his belt, and definitely is, and McLaughlin's about to replace Homer Lane as the top wrestler in the world. It's 1869. Homer Lane is the top wrestler in America. Colonel James H. McLaughlin's nipping at his heels. Homer Lane is the American heavyweight collar and elbow champion. That's all about to change. We got one more note before we go to our mid-show break, and we get to one of the biggest, most important years in wrestling, 1870. So 1870, I mean, to me, it's equitable to 1985, the year we had the first WrestleMania. And I, too, have a book on that time period, DragonKingKarl's 1984-1985 Pro Wrestling Omnibus. You can get it from Amazon just like you can the Pioneer Era book. But let's have one more note from 1869, and then we'll come back after a break and discuss 1870, one of the biggest years ever. September the 1st, 1869, New York City, New York, at Devereaux Hall. It was said to be heavily crowded. The American collar and elbow champion Homer Lane defeats Colonel James H. McLaughlin. For $1,500 a side, McLaughlin won the first fall. Homer Lane won the second and the third fall. The match lasted 3 hours and 15 minutes. McLaughlin had, for some time, also had a claim to the American collar and elbow championship. So, as we leave 1869, about to change to a new era, 1869, there is now one American heavyweight champion. That is Homer Lane. He is the person everybody's looking at. But the big story is coming, and it's the Detroit International Tournament. So when we get back after the break, we're going to start into 1870. Everything there really is to know right now about the International Tournament. You're about to become an expert in one of the most important moments in pro wrestling history right after this. Hey everybody, this is Carl Stern from WhenItWasCool.com. I'm here to tell you about my new book, now available, DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of professional wrestling. Pro wrestling didn't start with Frank Gotch. He didn't just appear out of the void to bring us entertainment-style professional wrestling. No, it was built on a legacy some 70 to 80 years old. That's what I'm going to talk to you about, an era of wrestling in America seldom ever discussed, never before in this detail. I have put 700 pages of information about the pioneers of professional wrestling, like William Muldoon, Colonel James H. McLaughlin, Professor Theobald Bauer, Clarence Whistler, William Miller, and so many more. Maybe some names you've never heard of before, maybe some you've only heard in passing. I will tell you the origins and evolution. Now available, Amazon.com, whenitwascool.com. All right, again, we're back, and let me encourage you right now, the script we're using for this show, this particular show, 1,000 Hours, comes directly from my book, DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era Wrestling. So this is what we're using as the basis of our show with additional commentary. So basically, this is your audio book with additional commentary from myself. So go purchase the book, and you can have your copy there. It's a massive book. And a lot of people really impressed with just, hey, I was expecting, Pioneer Era, not much is known about it, to get this book. And it really is the definitive source on Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling United States. This book's been in the works for 30 years. I've been working on the information going in this book. I mean, I first talked to Dave Meltzer about this book back, 30 years ago, I'm sure. And to have it here finally available and selling well, and I appreciate everyone who's picked up a copy. It's a very, very positive experience for me. So here we are, about to change eras again. And really, for most people, if you're listening to this series, when you come away, when we get done with this, you've got the book, you're going to be an expert on the Pioneer Era of pro wrestling. You're going to be the person that everybody can talk to about the Pioneer Era of wrestling, and that knows what they're discussing. You're going to be able to build off of that. And when most people talk about the Pioneer Era of wrestling, they don't even start talking about it until this point we're at right now. They start at 1870 and move forward. Well, we've already saw there was lots of wrestling. There were champion wrestlers. There was murder even in wrestling up to this point in time. So there's by only starting here in 1870, you're leaving off a huge portion of the story that's super important. But that's not to diminish from 1870, because it is massively important. And what I have here is, to my knowledge, this is the deepest bit of research ever done on the Detroit International Tournament of 1870. I have researched not only the Detroit newspapers, which those have been around for a while, but I've also researched numerous newspapers from the area, from the people who were in the tournament, from their newspaper, from newspapers outside of the area that were discussing the tournament. I've checked out all the latest books that have been written over the last, since I first started doing this 30 years ago. Got all that information, and what I have now, without mythology, without hyperbole, this is the story of really the birth of national pro wrestling in the United States. And so if you want to tell to your friends that, hey, wrestling really started, as far as popularity boom goes, in 1870, Detroit, Michigan, in an international tournament held there. That is largely, it's a simplification, but it's largely correct. Let's see how that went. So grab your book, DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, Era 4, Detroit International Tournament, and the Rise of Colonel James H. McLaughlin, 1870. 1870, unspecified specific date. Padded wrestling mats make their first appearance. Credited as among the first to use them were James Owens and his cousin Ed Cox, who stuffed comforters and used them to wrestle collar and elbow matches on. And so this is an old note. This is one of the oldest notes I have. This one probably goes back 30 years to that old Pioneer of Wrestling special booklet I did that our Patreon supporters, that's on the Patreon feed as well. You can get the PDF to that. This note come, I think, from one of the earliest Pro Wrestling Illustrated almanacs. They used to have some of this old school Pioneer Era history occasionally in their timeline. And so that's probably where this came from. So mid 1990s, pre-really internet research boom. So I don't know how accurate this is. It's kind of stood the test of time a little bit. as far as being debunked or whatever. And nobody really ever has come out and said one way or the other. So we're going to assume that this is still correct. And so your padded wrestling mats start in and or around this date. All right, so January the 30th, 1870, we get the first mention of the Grand International Tournament in Detroit, Michigan, and it's made in the Detroit Free Press newspaper. This tournament would be one of the most prestigious and famous of the pioneer era. The story read, quote, "The initiatory steps have been taken toward getting up a grand wrestling tournament to take place in this city sometime this winter. It is proposed to make the tournament open to the United States and Canada and to offer prizes, the leading one of which will be a championship belt," in bold in the book. So that means you'll have a DragonKingKarl note coming up for this. "Many celebrated wrestlers have signified their intention to be present, and there's every probability that the tournament will be a great event in the sporting world." Now, here's your DragonKingKarl note. "It is often mistakenly written that this tournament would award the first championship belt in pro wrestling. This is not true. Belts had been awarded for years in England and probably some in the United States also." January 31st, 1870. The Chicago Tribune, along with newspapers in Montana, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Utah, California, New York, Connecticut, Oregon, Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, Maryland, and Wisconsin, all run a news blurb about the upcoming Detroit tournament. So you see, news of this has gone all the way across the country, coast to coast. Let's see, on one side we got New York, and we have on the other side of the country Oregon, Maryland on one side of the country, out west in Montana, Nevada, Utah. So all over the country now news is spread about this upcoming international tournament. This entry in the book goes on to say, the prizes include a championship belt along with gold and silver medals. The Chicago Tribune report says that 12 wrestlers will be in the tournament, but does not name who they are. And it would be, I think, actually more than 12. And at one point in time, the number got up excessively larger than even that. All right, so February 4th, 1870, it is announced that the Detroit Opera House is being considered as the location for the Detroit International Wrestling Tournament. And this is another mythology about this. Many times in websites and newsletters, books, whatever, whenever this is discussed, the Detroit tournament is said to have taken place at the Detroit Opera House. It did not. It took place at Young Men's Hall. Detroit Opera House was at one point in time in the running for it, and later on did become a major point for wrestling in the pioneer era in Detroit, but it was not the site of this tournament, although they were hoping to have it there. February 6th, 1870, the Detroit Free Press newspaper runs the following update on the international tournament. Quote, "The committee of arrangements for the upcoming international tournament, which is to be held in Detroit next month, have received letters from a number of the more celebrated wrestlers in the United States and Canada, announcing their intention to enter the list, and the minor details of the tournament are being looked after. This pastime is one of the oldest in athletic sports. In ancient times, regular schools of instruction in the science of wrestling were common, and the annual exhibitions of strength in this direction were made occasions of great festivities. Representatives from a considerable number of states will be present at the tournament here, and it is proposed to arrange for an annual meeting also in each state represented and to offer state championship belts." So, and look, hey, after this, they really do go forth at least once by trying to do a state championship, a Michigan state championship. It falls apart before it even gets finished, and they never do any more. But originally, this idea was to have a world championship or a United States championship, I guess, and different states offered up their state champions to meet this. Wrestling ended up not really shaking out that way organizationally, but it was one of the early ideas here for sure. February the 24th, 1870, the Committee of Arrangements for the Detroit International Tournament announces it has changed the tournament date to March 10th and the location from Merrill Hall to Young Men's Hall. So still changing locations there. March the 3rd, 1870, the Detroit Free Press, 1 week prior to the Detroit International Tournament, publishes the following news. Quote, the Committee of Arrangements have concluded to offer prizes for the best wrestler in what is technically known as the Cornish and stand and catch holds. The former requires that the combatants be dressed in a collarless duck jacket and go into the contest either barefooted or with stockings on, boots or shoes being ruled out. So here, for a few minutes here, we're going to get into, if you've ever wondered what rules were adhered to in the pioneer era, largely from this point forward, most time they used these rules, these 1870 Detroit tournament rules. If you're wondering what the wrestlers looked like, what they wore, some of the nuances of the match, well, we're about to go through in the writing of the time exactly how they experienced. If you were a person there and lived in Detroit, Michigan at that time, reading the paper, you liked wrestling, you wanted to go gamble on wrestling coming up, you would be reading this. And you would know, and you would be on the ground floor of what would go on to become, a 150-year enterprise that would go through dramatic changes many times over the year, and it many times be very much toward the top of the pop culture wagon. It's one of the most popular pastimes in popular culture over the next 150 years. It's amazing. It's amazing that it's all going to really kind of launch from right here. March the 6th, 1870, a significant article in the Detroit Free Press newspaper details new information about the tournament and the rules. The coming international tournament rules adopted by the association at a late meeting of persons interested in the international tournament, which will commence at Young Men's Hall on the evening of the 10th instant, the following officers were elected: President Thomas Lewis, Vice President James P. Mansfield, and W. V. James, Sears Thompson. And I believe that by the way, is supposed to be Scars Thompson. We'll see him referenced again. N. H. Redmond, Secretary and Treasurer George Niles. The Biddle House has been designated as the headquarters of the association, and the meeting of those entering for the contest will be held there next Wednesday evening for the purpose of selecting the judges and umpire. The following are the rules by which the tournament is to be governed. The umpire and judges shall be selected by the contestants in the tournament, and all decisions by them shall be final. The names of all persons entered shall be in a hat or box, and when the name of the contestant shall be drawn each time by the umpire. The two contestants must be ready to take the stage upon the call of the umpire, as their names shall be drawn. All are required to remain in the dressing room during the exhibition in order to prevent unnecessary delays. No two contestants shall occupy the stage more than 10 consecutive minutes. If no fall shall occur within that time, they shall be off to rest, with two others to be drawn shall take their places for the next fall. So this is basically a time limit that fit within the rules of this, drawing names tournament. And so if you're 10 minutes, you've been wrestling for 10 minutes and nothing's happened, nobody's been thrown, well, you get off the stage and you'll come back and finish your match, but that's your fall, the end of that. And to keep things moving promptly. And this would be something that wrestling would struggle with over the years, is the length of time in these matches. And one fallacy that I think my book really helps people who want to see this, many times over the years, and I myself have even been guilty of thinking this, well, if a match has, goes 5, 6, 7 hours, that's real, right? Because who in the world would fake a match for that long, right? Who would work a match for that long? So that has to be real. It has to be like, they're just circling each other. And sometimes that is what it was, but that's not always. There were at times multi-hour wrestling matches that were worked, and a lot of it had to do with, Again, seeing how the gambling's going and stuff. So think about those things as you hear these rules as well. Each person entered shall be entitled to 3 trials. If any person is to lose 3 falls, he shall not be entitled to any further trials. The holds to be wrestled shall be square, side, back, and Cornish. Breaking a hold or 3 fouls shall constitute a fall. Side hold contestants shall have the choice of upper and under holds by lot unless they agree otherwise. And so again, this is very much the referee or the umpire's hold, referee's hold, whatever they call it, the side hold there and rest. So they're deciding these things out, and some of these things didn't make the transition on up into pro wrestling as we know it today. Others did. Some of us are old enough who started wrestling back in the 70s. You can even remember some of these nuances reaching even that far into history. But most of these things here have gone away. Now, this goes on to say there are now between 30 and 40 assured entries, and among these are wrestlers of more than national reputation in sporting circles. The tournament bids fair to exceed in interest any sporting event that has ever yet occurred in this city, and the character and standing of the gentlemen who have it in charge afford excellent assurance that it will be conducted in due regard to propriety. All right, so March the 9th, 1870, the Detroit International Tournament Committee met at Biddle House in Detroit, Michigan, to conduct business, which was reported the next day in the Detroit Free Press newspaper. Yes, the Detroit Free Press newsletter literally reported on this Detroit tournament every single day leading up to it. They would talk about business meetings, the different people. It was a big deal. It was a big deal. And because it was in the Detroit newspaper, Detroit Free Press was one of the major newspapers at the time. Many newspapers across the country syndicated out those stories in newswires, and so thus it was known across the country. All right, James Craig was chosen as the umpire. Stephen Knight and Sears Thompson were chosen as judges. The wrestlers listed in the newspapers having entered the tournament now take these with a grain of salt. Many of these are not, in fact, showing up in the tournament. But the original list, as it was listed in the paper, showed American collar and elbow champion Homer Lane. Of course, you would expect him to be in there. He is listed in there. He is not in the tournament. He does not show up in the tournament. Colonel James H. McLaughlin, Barney Smith, James Collins, E.P. Harrington, he's a known wrestler, L.T. Harrington, all these Harringtons are known wrestlers, L.T. and B.L. Harrington, William Nelson, Joseph Collin, Alfred Payne, William Tuttle, Hiram Nash, J.R. Roberts, J. Markham, and I'm assuming that's Jacob Martin, H. Bearden, James Rowell, Charles Bramble, James Defoe, Albert Rumsey, William Nash, James Carter, George W. Burke, Andrew Curry, James Cook, M.M. Eldon, William Bell, Matthew Brown, Edgar Harvey, Joseph Kiggins, C.C. Carr, and William Smith. And I know that's a list of names. 99.9% of you have never heard of any of these names before. Some of you recognize a few, obviously, like Homer Lane and the Harringtons and Jacob Martin probably. But for those of you who want to research forward into the future, or later on want to research this, there's some people to look at, because not a lot's known about these early pioneers. And again, many of these did not end up in the tournament after all. March the 10th, 1870, the Detroit Free Press reports the result of the Detroit International Tournament in the March 11th, 1870 issue. So here it is. Here's the result. Here's what happened on wrestling's first ever, what we would consider today a pay-per-view show or a monthly special or whatever. This was their big deal. This is their big show. The tournament at Young Men's Hall, the champion belt won by McLaughlin of New York. A Detroiter wins the second prize. Special matches announced for this evening. The International Wrestling Tournament, which has attracted so much attention during the last 2 months or more, came off as announced at Young Men's Hall yesterday evening. There was a large audience in attendance, and the tournament barring the failure of many of those who had entered to respond when their names were called, was successful and gave the very general satisfaction. There were some admirable exhibitions of muscular power, skill, and activity, and some of the rounds were of exciting interest. The first couple that appeared upon the stage were E.P. Harrington of Michigan and Barney Smith of Hamilton, Ontario. Side hold. Now, some dispute relating to the matter of taking hold were indulged by the men, and Harrington carried the point in question. The result of the fall was pronounced a foul by the umpire, which opinion Smith did not agree and refused to wrestle any more with the same party. The next fall was another side hold and was done by James Defoe of Detroit and William Bell of London, Ontario. Defoe winning the fall. Bell then reappeared in a back hold tussle with William Brown, also of London. After some very amusing and apparently scientific play, this fall was decided in favor of Brown, upon which James H. McLaughlin of New York, now McLaughlin's New York at this time, Utica, New York to be specific, but he ends up settling down and living for a long time in Detroit, Michigan, and is very much closely related to that city when you think of McLaughlin. Let's see here. Mr. Defoe and Mr. Brown then did some side hold business, which was concluded by the latter going down. The next fall was a square hold between McLaughlin and Harrington, won by the former, after which Bell and Brown had another back hold in favor of Bell. McLaughlin and Harrington took the boards again with the same result as before and were succeeded by Bell and Defoe in another side hold, which was won by Defoe. Now here's an interesting one, because remember, the longtime legend, the folklore, was that Barney Smith's going to die after this tournament. He's going to receive a head injury, walk around, be institutionalized, and die from that. That's long been the story. Well, there's no contemporary evidence that says that happens at all, but here they are about to wrestle in this tournament, so that much at least is true. McLaughlin and Barney Smith followed in square hold, which McLaughlin found it necessary to put his opponent down twice before either party was entirely satisfied. And one of the stories about this match was that McLaughlin felt like the referees, the umpires, were being unfair to him, and that he had to beat Smith multiple times, throw him multiple times, to get it counted as a fair fall, which ended up in him getting slammed on his head. So that part from the newspaper report does, there is some evidence there that McLaughlin had to beat Smith a couple times at least to win, and they'll wrestle again, I believe, before the tournament's over. Bell and Brown then came on again with their somewhat peculiar side of back hold, and after some pretty play, Brown was declared the winner of the fall, and Smith again appeared to succumb to the prowess of McLaughlin. So Barney Smith again loses to McLaughlin, so there they wrestle yet again. Defoe and Brown had another side hold, which was won by the former, and a back hold between Bell and Brown won by the latter, terminating the evening's sport. The prizes were then awarded as follows. First prize, champion belt, awarded to James H. McLaughlin of New York. Second prize, the gold medal, was awarded to James Defoe of Detroit. Third prize, the silver medal, was awarded to Matthew Brown of London, Ontario. This evening there will be a number of private matches at the hall in which several who failed to reach here in time last evening will engage. Mr. N.H. Redmond, one of the vice presidents of the association, announced that Mr. McLaughlin would wrestle any man in the United States or Canada tonight at square hold for $500 a side and the championship belt, and that Mr. Brown, the winner of the third prize, offered a similar challenge to backhold wrestlers. Now, I have a DragonKingKarl note because there's a lot to unpack here, right? The Detroit International Tournament was the biggest national wrestling news story up to this date in the Pioneer Wrestling history. The championship belt, awarded to Colonel James H. McLaughlin, has been considered the genesis point for numerous championships over the years. Yet there has been a considerable amount of mythology, misconception, and error concerning this tournament. But as you can see from the very detailed account which ran in the Detroit Free Press newspaper, which we now have access to, we can clear up many of these errors. I have included here my original entry, dating back over 20 years ago for this section, which mirrors my past reporting on the tournament. I have decided to leave it here and, in bold, give commentary to the erroneous facts that have previously been stated about the tournament, details that came up later, and things that may not have ever happened. All right, so what I did here is this was, basically 30 years worth of research is the original. And then what we know now, the latest, most correct, updated version, comes next. So here's the original, and then I'll give you the updated. So, and in the book, it's in bold, so you can tell. All right, so original entry for this book on the Detroit International Tournament with corrections and clarifications in bold. All right, the new stuff. Colonel James H. McLaughlin, the old stuff, rather. Colonel James H. McLaughlin defeats Barney Smith in Detroit, Michigan for the Diamond Championship belt. And I put now, demonstrably not true. Barney Smith did not even finish in the top 3 of the tournament, though he and McLaughlin wrestled multiple times. All right. Homer Lane was also in the tournament. American champion Homer Lane was announced the day before as being in the tournament, but did not show up. All right, I had written the rules were collar and elbow style. And again, clearly not true. This was something printed in a book well after the fact. All right, originally we said Barney Smith is said by some historians to have died soon afterwards, and McLaughlin donates his winnings to Smith's widow and apologizes, saying, quote, "I forgot I was so wicked strong." All right, so what we know now is this. There is not one single word in the Detroit Free Press newspaper, nor newspapers out of Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, about Barney Smith dying on this day, nor in the weeks or months to come. The first indication we get of Barney Smith dying that we can find came some 15 years later and may have been referring to a later match that took place in the East, although no newspaper evidence has yet to surface to back that up either. Now, I've discussed this situation in great detail on multiple episodes of the 1,000 Hours podcast available at whenitwascool.com. Barney Smith appears alive several years after this tournament as the, quote, wrestling champion of the Dakotas. Colonel James H. McLaughlin was interviewed many times after his final retirement, and to date, I've never read about him killing Barney Smith. Now, wrestling historian Steve Yohe relates the story of McLaughlin winning the collar and elbow title in the tournament. In the final match, he met the favorite Barney Smith, which, of course, we now know is not true, though McLaughlin did throw Smith multiple times during the tournament. I originally said McLaughlin threw him 5 times, but the judges refused to award him the title. So McLaughlin vowed to use all of his strength in the next match. He raised Smith to his hip and then flipped him over his shoulder. Smith landed off stage with his head hitting a rail, and he was carried off, and McLaughlin was awarded the first championship belt ever awarded in America. Now, I said this in the book. Again, this account seems very detailed and must have come from somewhere. I and multiple other historians and researchers have yet to turn up where this might have originally been written. I'm sure it comes from some source now lost to us, but it does not line up with the Detroit Free Press detailed reporting of the event. Now, I originally wrote, the next morning in the pouring rain, Barney Smith was found wandering the streets in his underwear. He was taken to an asylum where he died. Now, the current information that's in the book, again, there is no report of this in the newspaper. Also, according to weather reports listed in the Detroit Free Press on March 10th, 11th, and 12th, there is no report of rain. But it did snow on the evening of the 12th, which was outside our time frame, really. So I don't know. This doesn't line up. Now, the original reporting said, or I said in the book, or at least this was the long-running story according to many historians, including myself, who repeated this story many times. However, as I was doing research for the 1,000 Hours podcast, the When It Was Cool the When It Was Cool website podcast on the pioneers of pro wrestling, I have serious doubts about the Barney Smith story. There's not a shred of evidence to back this up in the newspapers, nor in any of the papers from Smith's hometown in Hamilton, Ontario. The old book, The Magnificent Scuffler, seems to be the only source that says that Smith died soon afterwards and that McLaughlin donated his earnings to his widow. The book, The Magnificent Scufflers, which was written now 89 years after the 1870 tournament, so long time later, simply says this, though, quote, after General Robert E. Lee surrendered, the discharged colonel, talking about McLaughlin, became a roustabout in the roaring frontier of southwestern Pennsylvania. There he took the opportunity to arrange and promote a catch-as-catch-can bout with a certain Barney Smith. It was good and lively bout, and Barney Smith died soon afterward. The survivor and the victor wept, presented the winnings to the widow, and explained, forgot I was so wicked strong. Real sorry, ma'am. The Magnificent Scuffler's books suggest that the fatal match with Barney Smith took place in southwestern Pennsylvania and not following the 1870 Detroit tournament, which may be true and may be the point of confusion. However, to date, I've not been able to uncover any corroborating newspaper articles to back up this event either. So until conclusive evidence surfaces, we will just have to leave that Colonel James H. McLaughlin killing Barney Smith in a wrestling match as unresolved or perhaps mythology. Now, wrestling historians Jason Campbell and Mark Hewitt independently did uncover a bulletin written in 1885, 15 years after the Detroit tournament. And it's telling some details of Smith dying after wrestling McLaughlin. But again, there's nothing in any newspaper to back up this story. So it seems that the Barney Smith dying after wrestling Colonel James H. McLaughlin story was either made up between 1870 and 1885, and versions were repeated thereafter, or possibly Barney Smith died at a different time and location after wrestling someone, possibly McLaughlin. The mystery remains. If there ever is a resolution, promise to report on it at When It Was Cool. Duncan and Will's Wrestling Title Histories book begins listing Colonel James H. McLaughlin as the American Collar and Elbow Champion at this point, holding it until December 1876 when he lost it to James Owens. Again, the American champion at Collar and Elbow Wrestling at this time was Homer Lane, who did not actually appear in the tournament as advertised, and this was confirmed in a special dispatch to the Chicago Tribune on March 11, 1870. The Chicago Tribune also, for some reason, repeatedly calls Barney Smith John Smith. I don't know. All right. And March 14th, 1870, the Cleveland Leader newspaper out of Cleveland, Ohio, runs a different but apparently first-hand account of the Detroit International Tournament. There are a few minor differences in the description of the matches, but no major differences of consequence are reported. Barney Smith was mentioned as being popular with the crowd. And we will conclude today's 1,000-hour show right here. And when we come back and pick it up, this is a great place to pick it up because what happened immediately following the Detroit International Tournament? Well, we have two champions, right? We have two champions. Now we have the Detroit International title champion, who even has his own belt, Colonel James H. McLaughlin. And then you have Homer Lane, who is the rightful American heavyweight champion, who chose, for whatever reason, not to participate in the tournament. But they're going to wrestle. They're going to wrestle coming up very soon, and we will have, for the first time in wrestling history, a undisputed champion. Who's it going to be? What's that going to look like? Well, you can read ahead by picking up a copy of my new book, DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of Wrestling. Hope you'll check that out and follow along. And in a couple weeks, we'll be back here for a new edition of this show. And in the meantime, I hope you'll become a Patreon supporter at When It Was Cool. That if you become a new Patreon supporter, we will dedicate an episode to this show to you, and you will keep this show going and help us support our site as well. So go to whenitwascool.com and hit any of those Patreon buttons. Just takes a second to sign up. You can cancel anytime, and that is literally how we keep our website going. So you can help us and help keep this show going as well. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you here again soon. Whenitwascool.com.